Hey, welcome in, everybody. Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich here on WCNC Plus with your live weather impact. Tonight's a big night. The full topic of tonight's show is going to be our winter forecast. You know, I've been doing this for 21 years now. It started off as just kind of fun. Really they didn't let me do this on TV back in the day. It was like a thing I did for fun because I love snow, I love skiing, I love the winter forecast. And so it's been something I've had a little passion for the last 2 decades plus. And so tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're going to reveal it on streaming only, so to make it kind of interesting. So here's a look at my winter weather impact. We're going to focus just on the forecast here in the first 8 minutes or so, but then Tim's going to join me. He's talking about the winter forecast for the Greensboro area, by the way. We're going to compare notes and talk about it. So if you have questions, shoot them to us, 704-329-3600. Anything I say or anything I don't say, I'd love to hear from you because I think that would be really cool to talk about what you guys think about this forecast as we get into it. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about when our average snow falls across our area. So in the Charlotte area, we broke this down by month just to give you a kind of perspective on when the snow falls. So you can see very little November, though we're going to talk about that little bit we got last Monday. December, not a lot. The 2 months we get the most snow, January, February, and that's going to be key to my forecast as well. But really February, and this says something because remember February only has 28 days and then 29 days during leap year. So it has the least amount of days of any of the winter or cool season months, but it has produced the biggest percentage of snow. So if you want to see snow in the Charlotte area, it's really February, and I'll be honest with you, that first week of March. Statistically, the snowiest single calendar day in Charlotte, that meaning the most snow that has fallen on a single calendar day over our entire history, is actually March 2nd. There's been so many big storms in that last week of February into early March. A lot of that has to do with the pattern that we have in the southeast. It's when the cold air is still lingering, but we start to get that active storm track. So that's the time of year we typically see snow. But I will mention November because last week we had our first trace of snow. But on average, our first measurable snow in the Charlotte area, on average, it can happen earlier, we can get it in December, is January 9th. So if it doesn't snow at all in December, don't think we're never going to see snow, because that's not normally when we see it. It is January. So the mean date, if you will, where we get measurable snow is usually right around January 9th. So we got to talk about this upcoming season. What is going to happen with El Nino, La Nina? We call that ENSO for short. It's the combination of either one. El Nino Southern Oscillation is what that ENSO stands for. Last year, we had a pretty strong El Nino. This year, the forecast and where we currently are is in a weak La Nina. So that's the basis of our forecast this year, looking at what happens during a weak La Nina. You may ask, Brad, what does happen when we have a La Nina pattern during the winter? Well, cooler than average water over the equatorial Pacific does produce warmer than normal conditions across the southeast and drier. But notice where that jet stream is. This is key. The jet stream is typically here across the Ohio Valley. We tend to be on the warm side, but because that active jet stream is so close to us, we can occasionally get a storm to sneak down here. So you should never write off a La Nina winter, especially a weak La Nina winter. Now, when we're talking about snowfall averages in these different regimes, in the Charlotte area, our all-time average, which goes back 147 years if we count this year now, is 5.4. But the last 30 years, the 30-year average has dropped to 3.5. And in the last 10 years, that average is even more meager at 2 inches. So if you think it hasn't snowed a lot lately, you would be correct. Remember, we had our first 2 snowless years in a row before last year. We finally saw, I think it was 1.2 inches. Now, in El Nino years, 5.6 is the average. In La Nina years, though, 4.1. And what is La Nada? That's the neutral phase. Actually, what's interesting is our weather in the winter, when we have a weak El Nino or a weak La Nina or even a neutral kind of in the middle, that tends to be our best snow years. It's not when we have really strong El Ninos or La Ninas. It's really when we're more in the middle of those two. And so when we look at some of the other things that I look at from a checklist standpoint, where are we with that ENSO? Well, right now with the weak La Nina, that usually means warm and dry. Above average snowfall in Siberia this year, there was slightly above. We looked at that in October. That usually means cold and dry. Arctic sea ice, unfortunately, still near record lows. That typically means warm and dry. And because of climate change and warm sea surface temperatures over most of the equatorial areas of the Atlantic, the Gulf, and the East Coast, that tends to be warm and dry. So typically a lot of the checklist like indicators would mean warm and dry. So overall, I would think warm and dry, but most people just care about the snow. Snowfall over La Ninas recently, obviously 22, 23, we had 0. But look at 21, 22, 4.3. And I want you to focus on 2010, 11. That was a very decent La Nina year. We had cold and snowy weather. That was one of the coldest winters I remember here in Charlotte. And that's always a wild card. So not all La Ninas are created the same. Remember our forecasting rules. Where do we look? I put the little check there because 3 to 5 days out is when you start to see the actual snow chances. So just remember that when we start getting into some of these forecasts. So let's get to the forecast. Cut to the chase, Brad, right? What am I forecasting temperature-wise? I think we will be above average, but not by a lot. I think it'll be just slightly above, so not a blowtorch. Certainly no big blowtorch this year. I think we'll actually see temperatures maybe close to average or a little bit above, maybe a half a degree to a degree, so not crazy. Rainfall-wise, this includes all precipitation, not just snow. It's going to be dry. I think the drought's going to continue. I just don't see a very wet pattern developing this winter. But what about snow? We can still have a dry winter and have snow. Remember, snow is 90% air. So you don't need a ton of moisture. You just have to have moisture and cold air time up. So snowfall, I actually think most of the Western Carolinas could be slightly above, and then many areas of the Piedmont near average. So I do think we're going to get snow this year. And as I do every year, I started doing this a couple years ago, let's look at the bold forecast. I like to forecast some ranges for some of the major cities across our area: Boone, Hickory, Charlotte. Boone's average snowfall is 25.6. I'm going to go 28 to 35. Hickory's average snowfall is 6.9 inches. I'm going to go 6 to 8 this year. And for Charlotte, our average snowfall is 3.5 inches, as I mentioned, over the 30-year average. I'm going to go slightly above, but if we get near average, I wouldn't be shocked. I'm going to go 3 to 6 inches, which would be the most snow we have seen in quite a while. Because I think this pattern is actually going to be pretty topsy-turvy, I think the chance of timing out 1 to 3 winter storms at some point late in the season, and I'm particularly talking January, February, is more than likely. So I do think we're going to see snow this year, but it will be mild. Coming up, Tim Buckley and I are going to kind of compare notes and talk about the winter forecast. Send your questions in, though, right now. Welcome back. Tim Buckley joins me from WFMY. If you're watching him, you saw his winter weather forecast. If you watched us, you saw our winter weather forecast. Now it's time to compare notes, Tim. Talk about our winter forecast. So kind of summarize your thoughts on what you think the winter will be like here in the Carolinas.
To talk about, Brad, and I think like you mentioned, this is, we're talking about months in advance here, so specifics, let's kind of forget those, but broad brushes, I think it's interesting because every year is a little bit different. Last year, we kind of started with El Nino earlier in the year. We transitioned into a weak La Nina. It seems like this is like the flip side of that, where we're kind of starting out in a weak La Nina and then going maybe toward an El Nino by the end of the winter. So it's interesting. I went back and looked at some of those winters for the Greensboro area, and it tends to seem like for us, we tend to start out a little on the cool side at the first half of the winter, and then maybe end up a little bit milder. But the snow chances are always a little randomized. So here are our data for Greensboro with weak La Nina winters in the past. Our average up here is around 8 inches. Several winters much above and several winters much below. Last year, we got about 5 inches around here. I think we'll have several opportunities for snow. So for us, I kind of went with temperatures near average or just below. And for snowfall, I actually think we'll be right around our average, which would be about 7 to 8 inches. So I don't think there's reason to despair if you're a snow lover. I think there's probably some good reasons for optimism, I would say, that at least we'll have our chances. And kind of like baseball, with Carolina's winter weather, it's all about like how many at-bats are you going to get. Every time we can only ever kind of guarantee that you might get some winter chances. It's never a guarantee you're going to get snow. But the more at-bats and times at the plate you have, the better chances you have of hitting a home run. So,
yeah, I mean, it's funny. We're kind of on the same page here. I think it'll be, from a temperature and like precipitation standpoint, probably mild and dry like a typical La Nina. But what's interesting is I agree with you. I think there's going to be maybe near average to slightly above average snow, because one of the weird things I saw with weak La Ninas in particular, as you mentioned, weak La Ninas, even weak El Ninos, kind of in the neutral. When we're somewhere on the border of the neutral stage, Tim, it appears that we have really crazy winters. We tend to get a lot of extremes, but we tend to get one or two, maybe one or three big storms that kind of sync up. And interesting winter I remember here, 2010-11 was a La Nina winter, but it was really cold and pretty snowy because we had a short range thing we looked at, North Atlantic oscillation, Arctic oscillation. A lot of blocking was occurring that winter. And even though it was a La Nina pattern, the East Coast was really cold and snowy, which is kind of interesting. So I do think there's some elements there. The other thing that I find interesting about La Nina winters, Tim, is with the storm track predominantly over the Ohio Valley, cold air damming events tend to be pretty much a common occurrence. So you always wonder about some of these ice storm kind of wintry messy kind of storms we call them, kind of being kind of a recurring theme this upcoming winter. What do you think about the ice threat and cold air damming? Because that's always one of those things I hate to say this because I don't think it really works this way, but it feels like we're overdue for like an ice storm, really.
It does feel that way. And, there's... Is being due a real thing or not? That's always a fun, philosophical debate, I guess. It kind of depends on who you trust here, science or whatever. But anyway, when we talk about cold air damming, I actually do think we'll probably have plenty of those events. And if we talk about the polar vortex maybe being a little bit unstable, which for folks watching, that's that big cold pool of air that typically is hanging out around the North Pole. There are some signals that maybe, especially into December, it could be a little wobbly, and maybe it wobbles into the U.S. a little bit. Those situations could be when you do get more of those cold air damming situations. At the same time, cold air is a tricky thing. If you get too much of that cold air, we had this last year, you're cold and you're dry. Because, that can really squash all the moisture to the south. So there are a couple ways to play it. You kind of have to really hit that sweet spot of having just enough cold air. You want the cold air damming, but you don't want it to be too deep that it makes you basically dry, that you don't really get even any snowfall or any precipitation at all.
Yeah, and I think, oftentimes when we see, even from the NSEP or, NOAA, they might issue a forecast and it might say mild and dry. I always like to caution people that doesn't mean no snow, because we've had warm, above average winters, below average precipitation, but we end up with above average snowfall because it's only been a couple of storms. And that kind of leads me to one of the first questions we've gotten here, Tim. So this is, I guess, I'll ask you as well because it was directed towards me, because my bold forecast for Charlotte was basically 3 to 6 inches. So the question is, Brad, your bold forecast is giving me hope. Do you think that 3 to 6 inch total will be over several events, or are you thinking just 1 to 2 snow events? So the simple answer is, scientifically, I think it will be multiple events. But if it's just one event, I still verify. So that's the great thing about it. But honestly, if you were to hey, Brad, what do you think? I think it could be, I really think 1 to 3 storms that might be stretched out. But honestly, we could be above average with just one good storm, Tim, because our average is only 3.5. And I've certainly seen it in the past. You get one good track and the cold air sinking up, and you get a 3 to 5 inch snowstorm, and that puts us above average for the year in the season, and it's only one storm. What are your thoughts? Do you think multiple events, or maybe just one big one?
I tend to agree. I think with the way things are setting up this year, I would always favor, especially for Greensboro, and that's probably one of the biggest climate differences between Greensboro and Charlotte, is the snow is way easier to happen up here.
Yep.
And you could say the same thing between Greensboro and Mount Airy. It's easier to happen up there, of course. Everyone is very different in the Carolinas, but I would also favor multiple events of snow for our area, but remembering it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And within our county-wide area, boy, if you live Asheboro South, you probably are usually on the lower end, but to the north, you're on the higher end. But I think multiple events is a decent opportunity. And I see James pulled this up. This is always a fun graphic I like to kind of go back to, just looking at history, how much snow we've had around here for Greensboro and the Triad area. The month-by-month breakdown is fun to me just because you look at when it tends to fall. December is our 4th snowiest month around here. So March actually leads the way, which is a much warmer month historically than December is, but you can get some big ones, and we've had just enough big ones historically that it kind of weights it in that favor. So it's interesting. Yeah,
we use a similar chart, Tim, and I love that chart because our winters here, like for us, at least in Charlotte, December's not a big month for snow. There will be an occasional one. We'll all remember like a big one because it's around the holidays. But that's why I always say don't count on a white Christmas because it's very unlikely for us to get snow. That's like a generational type thing. Happens about every 30 years, and then it doesn't happen for another 3 years. But what's interesting, our biggest snow dates are late February, early March, which is kind of similar to Greensboro. In fact, a couple of years ago, I started pouring the calendar days, like what date on the calendar had the most snowfall on that date over multiple years and storms. It's March 2nd in Charlotte. That is the snowiest statistical day of all of the days. And it's kind of weird. People give up on winter too early sometimes, Tim. It's like December and it doesn't snow on Christmas, and they go, oh, it's never going to snow. It probably shouldn't snow by then. It's really going to be February and March when we see our snow. And so I've always seen those dates where, like, man, it's late in the season where you see those events. So we had a question about accuracy. So, James, let me see that one. This is a great question. So I do go back and look. And last year I did verify, thank goodness. But statistically, to put this in, I've done this 21 years now. I'll have to recalculate it. But last time I calculated, it was about 65%. That's not great, but I'm okay if I get above 60% on a seasonal forecast. I'm doing something better than a coin flip, so I'm pretty happy with that. It's not the Farmer's Almanac, apparently, which is 80%, which we can never prove.
Shots fired, Brad.
But I'm pretty diligent. I look at, is it above, below? And the last couple of years, I've done the bold forecast, putting a range just for Charlotte for fun. I'm not so keen on verifying that. I just want to know if it's above or below. And if I verify, I'm basically, over my 20 years, it's been about 65% of the time. I've had some big busts, but last year was actually a pretty good one for me. Considering we had 2 years with no snow, the fact that I forecasted snowfall was pretty amazing by itself, Tim.
Yeah, and we're in a different world now. We're maybe not, I guess we're always snow thirsty, right? But last year, boy, we were coming off that big, long stretch. For us up here, we were 1,000 days without snow, which is only the second time that ever had happened. So at least we got something last year.
Yep.
I do feel like the vibe and the overall impression, if you go man on the street, people still say we haven't gotten a good snow in quite a long time. And that's the perception, whether it's reality or not. The last big one, at least, around here, and maybe you remember as well, was for us the 2018 snow, which at this point is like 7 years ago.
Yeah.
But December of 2018, and this is a winter, just like Brad was saying, it wasn't all that cold of a winter.
Nope.
We had very few events. In fact, for us, this was the only
That was the only event for us that year, too.
And it was just a whopper. I mean, for Charlotte, not so much, right? Just kind of a little bit low on the totals. But all you had to do was ride up into Burke County or something, or up by Hickory, over a foot. Greensboro, over a foot, one of our biggest daytime 24-hour snow totals. Boone was over 18 inches. I mean, this was a total whopper. And it was all snow for most of those places in the foot zone. There wasn't a lot of sleet or mixing. So I think for most of us, if you're a snow hound, you're remembering, all right, that's the one I want again. That's like your Hallmark Channel storm before the holidays.
That one sticks in my mind because you're right. Charlotte didn't get a ton of snow. We had snow, but our northern counties, Interstate 40 corridor up towards you. I remember at the time telling people, this is a pretty big deal. We don't normally get snow like this early in December. And that was an all-timer. That really was. And it was funny, Tim, because I remember that year, I think my forecast was for slightly below or maybe near average. And that storm happened. Everyone goes, oh, you're going to bust your forecast. But as you just talked about, and we joked, that was the only storm of the entire year. So I ended up verifying, and it all came from one single storm. So that was a weird year. That was, I mean, people were convinced, Tim, that because it snowed on the 8th and 9th in December, that we were going to have this hellacious winter. And it actually just got warmer and warmer, I felt like, as the winter went on. And people were like, yeah, remember that snow back in December? And we kind of all forgot about it. So, it's kind of interesting. The other winter that sticks with me, and I talked about it in my forecast, Tim, was 2010-11. I'm not sure, I didn't look closely at your graphic, but what did you guys have in 2010-11? Because that was a really peculiar year where it was a La Nina. And we had the snow here was 6.1, which is above average. But I remember more the cold. I think those 3 months, December, January, February, for Charlotte, the average temperature, not the high or low, the average of both was below 40 degrees for all 3 months. And we hadn't done that since like the 80s. It was in crazy cold winter.
That was a really cold winter. So kind of if you go back, and last winter, by the way, for us was our coldest one in quite a few years, just because it had been so warm for a while. But you're right. We haven't had a winter as cold as 2010 and 11. Since then, we were in the 30s for average temperature around here, 38 degrees. All the months were quite cold. It wasn't particularly snowy, in terms of, well, if we look back here, I'm seeing about 10 inches for us. So it was about on our average, just a little bit above. We've had some good ones after that since then, but the cold, I think, was the big story that year. And it goes to show you can get that in La Nina winters. You can get that. There are always exceptions to the rule. We look at these data for, El Nino or La Nina. It's not like, oh, that's the answer. This is the way it is. No, there's always exceptions. And we haven't even talked about, the snowfall in Russia and Siberia, the QBO or any of these things, the eastern phase. These are not things that we've incorporated today, right now, but there are so many other things that we're looking at when we're putting these things together that kind of muddy the waters a little bit for winter.
Yeah, and those are always the wild cards, like, those short-term teleconnections that are 1 to 2 weeks out that those can always throw you for a loop. Those are hard to predict months in advance. And I remember 2010, that's really what happened. That negative NAO and the blocking pattern just took over and it got cold. I just remember those winters. We had 2 back-to-back pretty cold winters, and primarily because I had a water line freeze from my house to the meter. One of those horrible things, you see water coming out of your front yard and you realize, I've got a broken pipe. So it was such a prolonged cold snap that caused those issues. So, James, what other good questions we got? I saw a good one about Christmas in La Nina.
Yeah, I decorated this graphic. What are the chances of having a white Christmas like the one in 2010, Brad?
Oh, that was Charlotte's White Christmas, and I think so many people remember that fondly. The other thing I remember about that, I think I went on a limb and forecast snow like 7 days out. And I not that I was forecasting them out, but I said, I think we could have snow on Christmas. And I was sweating that one because someone in our web department decided to put the headline, Brad guarantees snow for Christmas.
Or your money back.
And I was like, oh my gosh, that's not what I said. And so I was sweating that one, and it was a weird day. It snowed from west to east. It took all day for the snow to get here. But that year, I think every spot in North Carolina had snow either on Christmas Day or the day after, which was something that is rarely seen. So I will tell you honestly, my opinion on Christmas Day snow, it's not something that happens here. It's only happened 4 total times in our recorded history. And the fact that we had one in 2010, Tim, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think it's like hitting, the pin head of a nail or something with a shot. It's just too hard. It's just one date on the map. And so I think people wish for that every year, but it's probably something you shouldn't really wish for.
It's so hard to do, and I remember that when I was in Wilmington, we got flurries at the beach. It was probably after midnight, I guess. It was really late, but it was a remarkable event and something that doesn't happen all that often. But sometimes you can catch lightning in a bottle. Speaking of Wilmington, their biggest all-time record-setting snow, 1989, Christmas. So it does happen sometimes. And you never forget it if it does. But there's a reason you never forget it, because it doesn't happen all that often.
Yeah.
I would say, based on the way things look, at least for my area when I was looking at some of these analog years, it tended to seem like a lot of the weak La Nina winters favored a cooler December and then kind of, stabilizing a little bit after that. So we'll see. Some of those next couple of weeks, the longer range models that we're looking at, they're kind of setting that up. So, once December turns, it does look like it'll start to feel like winter. Will we have those at-bats? Will we have those storm systems? That remains to be seen. But I think we'll have our chances, and that's about the best you can hope for.
Yeah, one of my favorite stats for Christmas around here is it's been 70 more times on Christmas Day than we've had snow on Christmas Day. So probably not something I would be wishing for on Christmas Day. Yeah, you mentioned late season. I want to bring up this one thing that I talked about online, and I'll be posting my forecast later tonight, is late season La Nina. I'm talking winter into spring. And Tim, this is something we've seen across the Mid-South and even into our area. La Nina winters tend to end with severe weather, and sometimes getting severe weather early in the spring. When I'm talking, it was like February, March time frame. So I think that's one thing to watch out. It's not really winter weather related, but La Nina winters tend to have severe weather towards the tail end in spring. We get an early start to the severe weather season. So that would be another trend I think we should watch out for, because we've seen some big tornado outbreaks in La Nina winters across the South. So I would be really interested to see if that happens this year.
Yeah, and that can be a big concern, of course, too, as we go into March. So something to keep an eye on as well. I see James pulled this up. These are my silly snow rules. Rule
Yes.
number one is just it's hard to snow in North Carolina. So consider your sources. Be careful on social media. There are
Yes.
a lot of places you can get your info. We would encourage you to find your friendly local meteorologist.
Yes. I'm sure we'll get tons more questions, but thank you guys for tuning in. WCNC Plus continues right after the break.